Good morning, everyone. It is 10 o'clock Central Time, 11 o'clock Eastern Time, and we are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the 8 steps to clean your vendor master file when you are doing it manually. Some housekeeping items before we get started. This session is being recorded. You will receive a link to the recording within 3 days. Feel free to submit your questions anytime. They will be saved for the Q&A session during the last 15 minutes. And if we don't get to all of the questions asked during the Q&A session, we will follow up with answers via email. And then you may also submit additional questions via email if you have them following the webinar. And then lastly, don't forget to download the handouts. There is a PDF of the presentation and then also a brochure of my services. And then speaking of me, actually for this webinar, I am the speaker and the host, and I am Deborah R. Richardson, and you may have heard of me by my saying, putting the AP in happy. And as a previous AP senior manager, managing a team of 17, processing over 2,000 vendor requests per month, I now work with AP vendor teams that are still fully or partially manual to add authentication techniques, internal controls, and best practices. I was responsible for maintaining 140,000 active global vendors across 7 ERPs, and also the distribution of 24,000 plus 1099s per year. So yes, there was definitely a cleanup process for each of those ERPs. Now, I have the only site that I am aware of that is dedicated to the accounts payable vendor setup and maintenance process, where I have some free resources and tools, including a blog and podcast that are both known for providing actionable steps, like you'll see in this webinar, to help you with your vendor maintenance issues. Okay. And so the agenda for today, we will first look at fraud in vendor setup and maintenance. And then we'll talk about my proprietary authentication, validation, and management vendor process system, from which this 8 steps to clean your vendor master file directly comes from. And then that'll be our next agenda item. And then we will then talk about my 5-day vendor master file cleanup service. And then finally, we'll wrap it up with a Q&A session. But we are going to start now with our first poll question. Let me get that queued up. Okay. So I want to know, when was the last time you inactivated vendors in your accounting system or ERP? Was it this month, last quarter, last year, sometime before 2019, or never? And I do mean by that, I mean, when was the last time you actively reviewed vendors in your vendor master file to inactivate those that have not had activity? Okay, so we have one never, so this will be good. Last year, sometime before 2019, doesn't look like we have any that have done it actually this year. So I think this will be a very good webinar. This is very timely. So let's go ahead and let's get started with, let me close that out. We do have one that is this month, so that's good. So let me see if we get anything else before I close this out. Okay, last year. Yeah, this has been a different year, to say the least. All right, so I'm going to close that out, and we're going to go ahead and get started. Okay, let me, one different view. Let's get started. Okay, so let's talk about fraud in vendor setup and maintenance. And we're going to start with the U.S. So looking at the U.S. first, this U.S. map and the stats are taken from the FBI 2019 report of IC3 complaints. And you can see the total complaints for the year are just over 467,000, which is an average of 1,300 per day. And then more specifically, one type of fraud that affects those AP team members that are still processing vendor change requests manually through email that I'm sure you've heard of is the business email compromise scams, where a fraudster sends an email and attempts to trick AP team members into believing they are a CEO or some C-suite or a vendor in order to change the vendor bank details to divert payments. That has resulted in $1.7 billion in losses. But it's also a global issue, right? So the International Criminal Police Organization, or Interpol, is an intergovernmental organization with 194 member countries. And in October of 2019, they actually launched a public awareness campaign for business email compromise with the hashtag BEC Careful. And now with the pandemic, fraudulent emails have spiked. Think.Digital Partners have reported that hackers attacked world businesses 22 million times between April 13th and April 19th. So cyber criminals, not surprisingly, are really capitalizing on this moment. But the key here for global fraud is to be proactive in implementing authentication techniques, internal controls, and best practices, because no AP team member can be 100% all day, every day to spot these fraudulent emails, especially during shelter-in-place requirements, dealing with distractions, working odd hours to reduce those distractions of kids, spouse, roommates, or they're just working longer hours to make up for either less staff that are able to work or just due to having less tools than what they had at the office. So especially now, if you're still working from home or if you're going back into the office, resuming normal processes, I suggest cleaning your vendor master file to ensure that no fraudulent information got in, because not only do you have to put processes in place when you're onboarding and changing existing vendor details, but you need to maintain your vendor data in the vendor master file to catch anything that slipped through, and then to make sure that something hasn't changed since you onboarded the vendor or last made a change to their vendor record. It can also help you to provide a clean vendor list for that AP automation project that now your company may be looking at to address some of the pain points found during the work from home requirements. So let's talk about my proprietary authentication, validation, and management process that I use for my clients that still have fully manual or partially manual vendor processes to ensure real vendors and avoid both fraud and regulatory fines. And also, this is where this 8-step vendor master file cleanup is coming from. The first step is authentication, which is the confirmation of the vendor data source or delivery method of the vendor documentation. And the data source is really who is sending. And the delivery method can be email or vendor portal or fax or even hard copy. So you're going to validate one or the other. Now, if you have a vendor self-registration portal, then you would rely on the delivery method to confirm, since the login requirement really authenticates the data source. But if you're relying on email, fax, or hard copy, then you would authenticate the data source. And for anyone interested, I have an on-demand recording of a webinar that I did last week called Protecting Vendor Bank Details When You Receive Changes Via Email Beyond the Phone Call, that gives steps to add authentication in your existing vendor changes process when you're doing you still have a manual process. And that's why the authentication block there is green. And you can check that out on my site. It's deborah.richardson.com/webinars, and there'll be a link to it. There's a link here, and there'll also be a link later as well. And then one thing about that webinar is it does give some options to eliminate that confirmation phone call, and then it also gives some options to automate the authentication process if you don't have a portal and you're still doing it manually. Okay. Now, step 2 is where you validate vendor data before it is entered into your ERP, and you're probably already doing this piece, hopefully, to help with that, to make sure that you are validating all the pieces of information that you can, and you have the resources to do that. I do have a free download. It's a vendor validation reference list with resource links, which identifies not only the resources to verify a vendor is real and not on any watch list, but it is also divided based on the type of information being validated and on which vendor document you'll find it, such as the invoice or the contract. Also, it includes many of the links I provide in this webinar as part of the cleanup process and more. Now, the third step is management, where you revalidate or inactivate existing vendors in your vendor master file. So it's inactivating those vendors you haven't done business with, checking for duplicate vendors, and then also revalidating active vendor data. And again, this is the step that we are focusing on in today's webinar. Now, I also have an e-guide that includes 5 authentication techniques, 12 internal controls, and 13 plus best practices. And it's all, again, based on the Authentication Validation Management. And I will have a special offer at the end of this webinar that may allow you to get this for free. So now that you can see my entire process, let's look at the 8 steps to clean your vendor master file. All right, so the first step is to inactivate vendors with no activity. And why? Because you want to make sure you have up-to-date and accurate information on file. If the vendor has not been active for whatever time period you choose, you want that vendor to get updated supporting documents and then revalidate that information. So you inactivate them, which means when you want to do business with them again, you will collect the same information as if they were a new vendor. So you will have updated documents to revalidate them with. And not only that, but having less active vendors in your vendor master file, it means the less susceptible they are to both external and internal fraud. And then inactivating vendors are done first so that you can reduce the vendor volume for all of the remaining steps. And when I handle this process for my clients using the 5-day vendor master file process, I find that an average of 50% are inactivated. 50% of their vendors are inactivated. And of course, that percent will be higher if they haven't inactivated in a while or ever, but it can also be lower if they perform the step on a regular basis. But starting with the inactivation process means you have less vendors to deal with for the rest of the steps. So the first thing you want to do here is to determine if your inactivity period will be 12, 15, 18, or some other number of months of inactivity based on your company's business needs and industry. And each company is different. So choosing a time period that works best for their processes. A big one, though, that I don't recommend is 12 months because inactivating after 12 months is just not enough time because it really includes those annual vendors. And so it just doesn't give enough time for those annual payments. Now, in the past, I have used 15 and 18 months, and at one company, we actually decreased that inactivity period from 18 months to 15 months at the request of purchasing. And this was so the company could get a better handle on strategic vendors. So just be careful because they actually asked for 12 months and they just didn't really take into consideration vendors with annual payments. We actually did have a big chunk of vendors from another large stakeholder group that did not go through purchasing. It was for rent. So they didn't go through purchasing and they had a lot of annual payments. And I'm just saying that to make a point that you need to take all internal stakeholder groups into consideration when determining that number of months. Okay. So once you've identified the number of months of inactivity that you're going to use, you're then going to review the vendor purchase order, their purchase order activity, their invoice activity, their payment, and vendor record activity. And for some ERPs, this means pulling multiple reports and, of course, using Excel magic to review. Now, there is some automation out there, and you may be lucky enough in that you have an accounting system or ERP that actually has the ability to look at those four activity points to verify whether or not that vendor should be inactivated. In the past, I have used PeopleSoft, and PeopleSoft was customized to look at the PO, invoice, payment, and/or vendor record activity to see if the vendor should be inactivated. And so it was just a process that we had to run. SAP, however, was not the same. Yes, there is that XK99, but you actually have to have that review done first to see which vendors were eligible to be inactivated. So if you have a system where it's not an automated process to do that review of those activity points, there's still an option with digital employees, bots, or RPA, robotics process automation. So anything that can have rules built is a candidate for RPA. So the bot could possibly set up to deliver the reports, to run and then deliver the reports to you via email, or they can take it a step forward that once they run the reports, they can consolidate, format, and then check the dates across the reports to identify which vendors should be inactivated. And I actually have 2 podcast episodes, I believe episode 39 and 55, where I had a company called Diversified Robotics on as guests. And what they do is they build bots for you for just such an occasion, And I'll include a link to my partners page so you can check them out. But they have a really unique business model in that they will come in, and I think he said it takes about 4 weeks. They'll review your processes. They'll set up the bot, and you actually get all of that free for 2 months, or for 2 weeks, I'm sorry. And then if you use my link, you can get it free for 3 weeks, because they are just so sure that after you see how well it works, that you'll want to continue it. So it's worth a look. Okay. So now that we have inactivated all the vendors with no activity in our set number of months, we can now look at validating the information. And we're going to, on those remaining active vendors. And we're going to start with address validation and standardization. And so what you can use for that, USPS address, the United States Postal Service, has some web tools that will allow you to do a bulk upload file and validate US and international addresses. And I've included the link here. And then there's also an option to use the Universal Postal Union site to validate international addresses individually. They do talk about an EDI process, and that may be an option for your IT team to configure. If you have a subscription to 10check.com, which I know a lot of you do, they will also do address standardizations. But keep in mind, it's only those addresses that are included in the USPS database, because that's where they're connected. So if you are a foreign country, or if your company is not in the US and you are sending to another company that is not in the US, you may want to use a Universal Postal Union, even if you do have 10check.com. Now, another option is called Smarty Streets. And Smarty Streets provides US and international addresses, and they do have an easy bulk upload. They also have an API as well. And what it will do is it will convert it to the proper address format. It will add missing data to addresses. And the best thing that I like about it, and I do use it in my 5-day vendor master file cleanup service, is it will validate the address status. So it will tell you whether it's a match, but it'll also tell you whether that match is mailable, whether it is inactive or vacant. Another big thing it'll do for you is it'll tell you if it's a PO box only. And you can use this one to make sure you're collecting an actual physical street address instead of PO boxes, you know, where the vendor can give you the street address of the post office or the UPS store where they're renting their PO box. This can tell you if it's a PO box only, and then you can go back to the vendor and request a physical address. So it's good. It just provides a little more information than the U.S. Postal Service and then also the Universal Postal Union site. Now, the cost of it, it's actually free up to $250 per month. But I do know during this process, you probably have more than 250 vendors to check. I did see that they had an option of $5,000 per month, and that's about $50. So it's not something that's prohibitive, but it can be a paid service, especially when you're validating mass vendor records, as you would do during this cleanup process. Okay. Another point here, and I actually did include it on my vendor validation reference list, but another point here is I had a client add Google Earth to their list of resources. And while I don't think, it stands on its own, but if you have an address that you can't validate, rather than going back to the vendor immediately and saying, hey, this is a bad address, you can check Google Earth. And I've seen one instance where it confirmed a fraudulent request because it showed an empty lot, no kidding, next to a liquor store. So Google Earth can have its place. All right. So after we're done with validating the address and then also standardizing it, step 3 is the IRS 10 match. And this is really because, you know, vendors are not going to tell you when they have a name change or a tax ID change. They really only contact you when they haven't received payment or their payment information has changed. And so if they've had a name change and it changes the name on the invoice, of course it's going to kick out, and then you'll reach out to the vendor. Sometimes they'll be proactive and send you that information, but most times not. They won't contact you unless for some reason they don't get paid. So you want to verify that you're catching those changes, and then you also need to be proactive to identify changes definitely before 1099s are due to be sent out or those related tax filings are done. So you want to use the IRS, the bulk 10 match process, to upload a file and validate that vendor legal name and tax ID in your vendor master file still match. And they say that it takes 48 hours, but sometimes it's done sooner. You can also do the same with a bulk upload on 10check.com. The last time I did it, it was $187.50 per file. I think that was for, it limited to a number of records, and I think it was 850 records. And then after that, they have like an incremental cost per record. But one of the things that it does do that the IRS doesn't do is that it'll do additional validations against watch lists. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So it may be worth your while to do 10check, because in addition to the IRS legal name and tax ID check, it also does additional watch list. And then once you do that, either from the IRS or from 10check, you'll want to follow up with vendors for any mismatches and require either a new IRS W-9 or a W-8 form. And of course, this reduces B notices because you're catching mismatches in advance before you file. Now, step 4 is to validate bank details. And you really want to check the ABA routing numbers, the SWIFT codes first, since they can be shared across multiple vendors. And the point here is that if you have a routing number change, for example, due to bank acquisition, which happens all the time, all the vendors with the old routing number can be updated. Now, this saves you the notices from the bank asking you to change your routing number. And then you can also check the IBANs as well. Now, each of these numbers, as I said before, can be affected by bank mergers and acquisitions that can result in ACH or wire returns. So for ACH payments, the routing numbers can be checked here. And of course, because the routing numbers for some banks can be different for wire payments, there is, you would still go to the same place, but there is separate links for wire and then also for ACH routing number checks. And then here is an option for the SWIFT code or the SWIFT and BIC code. And then I added an option here for TGBR, and that is a software from Acuity. It's a subscription plan, and really what it has, and it's paid, but really what it has is the history of routing numbers, which comes in handy if banks have merged or been acquired multiple times. TGBR keeps that history. Also, it does have a feature called IBAN Complete, which can validate your IBAN format. Now, it doesn't, none of these options will validate the account number, but TGBR will validate the IBAN format. And one of the reasons, and I've actually used this in the past, and one of the reasons I found it valuable was because of the IBAN issue. I've had my employees, you can go out on the internet and you can find tools to validate IBANs based on country. I've had conflicting results for the same IBAN for multiple or two different tools. I've seen that occur. And so because of that, we signed up with Acuity for a TGBR. It's not inexpensive, but it was something that had a valid way to validate IBANs. All right, so again, none of those really check the bank account. So here's some options for that. You can check the bank account name and the bank account number to ensure that they match the bank records and that the bank account name matches your vendor's legal name. This service is available for bank accounts in the US. And the first one is early warning, and you may have heard of these, but the first one is early warning. So if your company banks with JP Morgan, Bank of America, any of the 6 or 7 banks in that consortium, you can speak with your rep at your company's bank to add this service. If your company does not bank with the 6 or 7 banks in that consortium, then you'll have to use their reseller, which is GIAC and GIAC Systems actually. And one thing to point out is, these services provide bank account ownership based on a large database, and that database is populated by US banks voluntarily contributing their data. So the issue is that coverage can be low in areas where smaller banks or credit unions just don't have the staff to, contribute and submit that data. Now, the monthly cost is based on the number of transactions. And one tip that I actually found is that if your company also deals with customers, that department may already have a contract with Early Warning or GIAC because they also offer a customer account health product as well. So you may be able to piggyback with account ownership, which is what we're asking, what we're talking about here. So you may be able to piggyback off their existing contract. And that actually did happen to me when I was looking at it when I was an AP practitioner. So you may be able to piggyback off another department's contract if they already have it for customer account health. So step 5 is to validate sanction and exclusion lists. And here you want to use the vendor legal name to verify that the vendor has not been added to these lists since you onboarded them or last updated their vendor record, because hopefully in those scenarios you are checking against sanction and exclusion lists. So you want to first check or also check with the foreign assets and control. And really, they have a specially designated national list in addition to others. And you want to do this validation for all your vendors because you are not supposed to pay vendors that are on this list. And your company will get a fine if you do pay a vendor, even if that vendor was okay or did not appear on the list when you onboarded them. If they subsequently was added to that list and you paid that vendor, then your company can be fined. And the OFAC fines are a lot higher than the IRS fines and interest and penalties. So you want to make sure that that's done and you check this on a regular basis. Now, I heard of a company that checked it before every pay cycle. I can't imagine, what that entails because I don't think that they have a bulk way to do it, but I haven't personally seen any companies do that. But as part of your vendor master file cleanup, I do recommend that you check against the OFAC as well. And so the next one is the System of Award Management, or SAM. So if you are a government, no vendor you do business with should be on this SAM exclusion list. And this is kind of the same with the Office of Inspector General, or OIG. If you are a healthcare provider, you cannot do business with any vendor that is on this exclusion list. And then the next one, a lot of healthcare providers check against the Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS, as well. And this list includes those import-export vendors. And if your vendor is found on their denied persons list, you are supposed to exercise due diligence, which to me means that you don't do business with the supplier. Now, again, looking at some automation, this is a lot to check, but as I talked about before, the good news is that TinCheck includes all of these lists with their IRS TinCheck and address standardization service, plus more at the state level. And the last I checked, they have 24 plus validations, including the Social Security Death Master file. And that's used to catch individuals trying to use another individual's Social Security number. Now, unfortunately, because the Social Security Office and the IRS don't really coordinate, Social Security numbers can be the same as EIN. So I do stress that it's to catch individuals trying to use another individual's Social Security number. You can't really compare that to EINs. Okay. And then also there are risk monitoring services out there that are either standalone or available in your vendor self-registration portal. This service can continuously monitor your vendors and notify you if they appear on a watch list. They can also alert you if the vendor has any negative press or if they file for bankruptcy. It really just depends on the third-party provider you go with, but they do have third-party providers out there that can provide that continuous monitoring. All right, and so now we're going to go to the second polling question, and let me cue that up. And this one is, do you have foreign or non-US vendors? And this really means if you are a US company and you have vendors that are not in the US. And so that means they need to abide by like the IRS tax rules. And your possibilities are yes, 50% or more, yes, 30 to 50%, yes, 10% to 30%, yes, less than 10%, or none. And I really asked this question because the next step is to deal with validations that are really not applicable to US vendors. Okay. Wow, so it looks like most have yes, 10 to 30%. Okay, we got a bit that has less than 10%, and we've got some that don't have any. All right, so to the ones that don't have any, I would really recommend that you verify that in your vendor master file. So if you haven't done a cleanup, make sure you do that, because when in the past for acquisitions, when I've inherited vendors with a lift and shift of the ERP, I found that they say, hey, yeah, we don't have any foreign vendors, but the address is told a little bit different. And so I just really make sure that that you check that really closely. Okay. All right, so the next one, we are going to talk about step 6. Let's get on here. Step 6, validating the tax registration numbers for foreign vendors. And you really want to validate based on your vendor countries. And every vendor country can have a different type of tax registration number to validate. So just make sure during this cleanup process that you are doing the same tax registration number validations that you did when you onboarded the vendor. But for this webinar, I'm going to use VAT and GST examples. So you want to validate the value added tax or VAT number for EU vendors or countries that have VAT. And you would really do that using the VISE system, the VAT Information Exchange System. And that's actually free of charge. And I don't know if they have an option for bulk. I do know that when I've used it, it's really a one-by-one. But for those of you who have, what was it, the 10 to 30%, that was like the majority, you may just have to assign someone to go in and just check these one by one. But they could have a bulk option. I just haven't seen that. And then for GST, really have GST for vendors in Canada and India. And so the GST/HST number in Canada, this is where you would validate it. You can also validate the business number that your vendor may also have if they're a Canadian vendor. And then for India, here is where you would go to validate that GST number. And I really added VAT and GST to make a couple of points. One, unlike other tax registration numbers that are on the vendor record, you may have to seek additional documentation such as the invoice to get the VAT and the GST. Unless you ask for it, like if you have a separate vendor setup form, it won't come on like the normal documentation. So you may have to ask for that invoice. And then two, the other point I wanted to make is where, you know, for example, we're including or we're collecting and validating the tax ID that helps those vendor maintenance teams that have to distribute and file 1099s. The GST and the VAT number don't really have anything to do with vendor maintenance. We're just collecting it for the team that uses this information to file and reclaim taxes paid. But it doesn't make it any less important since the whole company is a team, if you think about it that way. And back when that GST number in India changed to issuing a separate GST number for each state, my team worked really closely with the tax team to see how we could capture GST at the state level. And we actually were able to customize one version of our PeopleSoft ERP to record that number at the address level. But for the other ERPs, it just wasn't possible. And the tax team ended up tracking those GSTs manually at the address or state level. And so the point was that we worked with them to try to see what we could do to ease their burden of collecting that information. Okay. And then, of course, like I said before, you validate other countries as needed. And then step 7 is to validate other regulatory and third parties. And again, this is just like the tax registration numbers. These are things that you collected or verified when you onboarded the vendor or when there was a change. And this is really based on your company's industries and processes. So you may be collecting or may have to verify with Dun & Bradstreet, validate their DUNS number and or their credit history. Some companies actually check that for their vendors. And then you may also be a company that requires insurance certificates. So you want to verify the expiration date and then collect that if it's expired or missing. And then, of course, I talked about any other company and or industry-specific requirements just to make sure that you are compliant with all of your company's regulatory agencies or any agencies really unique to your industry. All right, step 8, analyze vendor records. So finally, the last step. But it's not quite the best news because it's also the longest step. So here's where you will analyze records to find duplicates and then follow up with the vendor where you're unable to validate their information. So first, you want to address duplicate vendors, and you really want to review to validate if the multiple vendor records are truly duplicate. You want to verify their tax IDs, verify their legal name versus DBA, look at them across addresses. And if it is determined that the vendor records are a duplicate, then you want to inactivate all but one vendor record. And this does require some research because you need to determine which record will survive and base that on any open activities such as unpaid invoices or open purchase orders. All of that will need to be taken into consideration. And sometimes if you have open activity on multiple duplicate vendor records, you need to decide which one will survive, and then you need to work with purchasing. You may need to work with purchasing to close a purchase order and open a new one on the surviving vendor. So it does take some review and research if you have multiple duplicate vendors with activity on each. So now that you have gone through all the steps to inactivate vendors with no activity, you want to validate those active vendors that are left. And so now it's time to follow up with vendors that have incomplete information or information that was not successful when you did your validation. So you want to reach out to the vendors by email or phone and request the missing data be submitted. And you really want to require the data to be submitted on the appropriate forms, what you normally require. So if you have a vendor setup form, you want to have them fill that out. If their legal name and tax ID didn't match, you want them to submit a new W-9, and then perform validations as required based on the data that you just collected. Now, to make this easier, because this honestly can be a long drawn out process, because you've got to reach out to the vendors, and then in some cases there can be a back and forth and you have to wait for the vendors to respond to you. I do suggest, to make it easier, that when you reach out to the vendor, you give them a deadline to respond, and then that way you're not in this perpetual follow-up mode. And if they do not respond by that deadline date, then you want to inactivate those vendors, because again, you want to make sure that your vendor master file is clean, and you've already determined that there's some issue with the vendor, they haven't responded. So I would suggest that you inactivate. Now, there may be certain scenarios where you cannot inactivate, like if they have open POs or invoices, or maybe if they're a reportable vendor and they've received payments in the current year. So for these, I would suggest putting them maybe on a payment hold and then continue to follow up with them. But at least now they have some type of incentive to quickly reply. But if you do put them on a payment hold or inactivate them, and you know that that they have internal stakeholders that would be interested in that, make sure you reach out to them and let them know, because you don't want to, you just want to make sure you get that information that you're missing. You don't want to, deteriorate any vendor relationships. Okay. And then to make it easier for internal stakeholders, right, because as soon as you inactivate a vendor, there will be someone internally that's going to reach out to you, to at least one of those vendors the next day, because they're going to need that one of those vendors the next day. That always happens. So put yourself in their shoes. They may have looked that vendor up on a Friday. You may have done the automated inactivation process over the weekend, like we used to do, and now on Monday they go to create a PO and the vendor is inactive. So you want to make sure that you publish an internal list of inactive suppliers. Maybe add that to your internal intranet page. Make sure it's labeled internal use only so it doesn't get distributed out. And then you also want to include it in your vendor setup and maintenance policy. And if you don't have one, I do suggest that you get one so that everyone is aware, and more importantly, that management has signed off on it, because you may get some pushback on this one. Okay. And then lastly, just looking at the time here, I just listed all of the 8 steps. And this is really, again, consistent with my authentication validation management process that we started off with. But you just want to make sure you're consistent by doing this each month, each quarter, but no longer than annually. And then combine it with, revising your vendor processes to make sure you're authenticating the data source or the delivery method, and then that you're validating the vendor master file or the vendor information prior to updating your vendor master file. And really combine with the cleanup. This is how you keep your vendor master file clean. And again, it all goes back to the authentication validation management process. And so we've come full circle. And so here, I just want to quickly talk about my vendor master file cleanup. And this is for those folks that either don't have an automated system or don't have the staff to regularly perform the vendor master file cleanup. And this just gives some information on that. It also shows some of the things that I do, and then there's also a secure file transfer, so you don't have to worry about your vendor sensitive data being compromised. Okay. And then I talked about my vendor team resources. On the left, there's some free resources. There's my website, and then also there's the partners page if you want to take a look at Diversified Robotics. And then for those folks that either attended the webinar or watches the on-demand recording of it, I will offer a special here where you purchase a 5-day vendor master file cleanup. You'll get my 3-step vendor setup and maintenance process toolkit, which includes fillable vendor setup forms, desktop procedures, email vendor communications, and also a free e-guide. And all of that helps you to authenticate the vendor, validate the vendor, and then combined with cleaning your vendor master file will help keep your vendor master file free from fraud. Okay. And then there's information to connect with me or reach out to me. And then I also put a link to my podcast. And so really quickly, the third poll question, what accounting ERP system do you use? SAP S/4HANA, SAP ECC, or other, Oracle, NetSuite, or other. Quite a few folks with other. And I'm not sure if you guys are aware, but SAP ECC 6.0, that version, will be retiring at the end of this decade, and not retiring, but SAP will no longer support it. And so we've got lots of projects with folks going over to or upgrading the SAP S/4HANA. And I do have a podcast coming out tomorrow where I'm talking with a SME on that. All right, and so, yeah, we got most people with other, couple folks with Oracle. All right, so let's go ahead and start the Q&A. And again, I apologize, this went a little long, so any questions I don't get to here, I will reach out to you via email and answer those. And then, of course, you can contact me at info@deborarrrichardson.com if you think of questions after the webinar. Oh, I am so sorry, guys. It looks like I did get a message here that said after the poll closed, you were no longer able to see my slides. So I'm not sure if that also happened with the recording, but I hope you were able to download the handouts and then follow along with the presentation. Now, if this did not occur on the recording, I will re-record this separately, and again, you will receive a link to that after the webinar is done. So you'll receive a link to the recording, which will include the screens as well. I'm sorry, I wasn't aware of that. I didn't open the question. So again, hopefully you were able to follow along. We did have a couple of questions. What if the first one is, what if other internal departments want to approve a list of your vendors to inactivate? And so that's actually a really good question, because this actually did happen to me. And, one point is that you really don't want other teams to have authority to, have that approval over vendors that are eligible to be inactivated. Other internal stakeholders may have different motivations and don't really understand that you are inactivating vendors to make sure you have valid information. So even if, you know, departments like purchasing, for example, say they will need the vendor in 90 days and that vendor has been inactive for, I don't know, 2-3 years, you still need to revalidate that vendor's information. And so you still need to inactivate it. And for that reason, I don't recommend that you provide that list to other groups so they can approve which vendors need to be inactivated, because their motivations and your motivations are different. Okay, so I do want to respect everyone's time. It is 11 o'clock, and again, if you have any questions, please feel free to, any additional questions, please feel free to contact me via email. And then also I will provide a link to the recording that includes the screenshots within 3 days. Thank you everyone for attending, and this webinar is now concluded.